Victoria Blackwood had always believed that words held the power to change everything. As she sat in her mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by the leather-bound first editions of her 12 best-selling mystery novels, she felt the familiar thrill of crafting the perfect sentence. Her latest manuscript, Shadows in the Garden, was due to her publisher next month, and the story was flowing like wine at one of her famous dinner parties. The Georgian manor she shared with her husband Marcus overlooked the rolling hills of Connecticut's countryside. 23 years of marriage had filled every room with memories, photographs from their travels to Scotland, the antique typewriter Marcus had given her for their 10th anniversary, and shelves lined with literary awards that bore her name. At 45, Victoria felt she had achieved everything she'd dreamed of as a young woman scribbling stories in coffee shops. Marcus Thornfield was everything a successful author could want in a partner. His architectural firm had designed some of New England's most prestigious buildings, and his steady presence had anchored Victoria through the emotional storms that came with creating dark fiction. He understood her need for solitude during writing phases and celebrated her successes as genuinely as if they were his own. "How's the murder going today?" Marcus would ask with a grin, bringing her tea during her afternoon writing sessions. It was their running joke. How could someone so kind and optimistic create such deliciously twisted plots? That Tuesday in October changed everything. Victoria had been driving back from a literary conference in Boston, her mind still buzzing, with ideas from workshops and panel discussions. The rain had started suddenly, turning the autumn roads slick and treacherous. She remembered the headlights of the oncoming truck, the moment when physics took control of her life. And then nothing. Until the hospital. The neurologist's words felt like a foreign language. Incomplete spinal cord injury, T12 vertebrae, permanent paralysis from the waist down. The technical terms couldn't capture the magnitude of what they meant, that she would never again walk through her garden at dawn, never climb the stairs, to her writing loft, never dance with Marcus at their friends' weddings. For the first month, Marcus was everything she could have hoped for. He slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair, researching the best rehabilitation centers and interviewing specialists. He held her hand through the physical therapy sessions that left her exhausted and frustrated. When she finally came home, the house had been transformed with ramps and wider doorways, her study relocated to the ground floor. "We'll adapt," he promised, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a deep sadness. "Nothing fundamental has changed between us." But something had changed, even if neither of them wanted to acknowledge it. Victoria saw it in the way Marcus's shoulders sagged when he thought she wasn't looking, in how his laughter no longer came as easily. The woman who had built her career on observing human nature couldn't miss the signs of a man struggling under the weight of unwanted responsibility. Elena. Vasquez arrived on a crisp November morning, a 50-year-old former nurse with gentle hands and infinite patience. Marcus had interviewed dozens of candidates before choosing her, and Victoria could see why. Elena treated her not as a victim to be pitied, but as a person adapting to new circumstances. "Your husband went to considerable trouble to make you comfortable," Elena observed during her first week, noting the expensive modifications and adaptive equipment. "Yes," Victoria replied, watching Marcus hurry out to his car without his usual goodbye kiss. "He's very thorough." As winter settled over Connecticut, Victoria threw herself into her writing with desperate intensity. If her body had betrayed her, her mind remained sharp as ever. But even as she crafted intricate plots about justice and revenge, she couldn't ignore the growing distance between her and the man she loved. The signs were subtle at first. Later, nights at the office, weekend conferences that seemed to multiply, the way his phone buzzed constantly with messages he would answer in another room. Victoria, who made her living understanding motivation and deception, began to see a pattern emerging that no amount of love could make her ignore. Marcus Thornfield stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his downtown office, trying to reconcile the man looking back at him with the husband he'd been just 6 months ago. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, but it was accompanied by something else. A lightness he hadn't felt since Victoria's accident, a sense of possibility that made him hate himself even more. Natasha Sterling had joined his architectural firm 3 weeks before Victoria's accident, hired as his personal assistant after his previous secretary retired. At 28, she possessed an effortless elegance that turned heads in the office corridors. Her auburn hair caught the light just so, and her smile seemed to brighten even the most mundane Monday morning meetings. Initially, Marcus had maintained strict professional boundaries. He was devoted to Victoria, proud of their marriage, and had never been the type of man to stray. But after the accident, as the weight of becoming a caregiver pressed down on him, Natasha became an unexpected source of comfort. "You look exhausted," she'd say, bringing him coffee during his increasingly long office days. "When was the last time you took a real lunch break?" Those lunch breaks had started innocently, conversations about work projects, then gradually shifting to more personal topics. Natasha was an excellent listener, nodding sympathetically as Marcus shared his struggles with Victoria's condition, his fears about their future, his feelings of inadequacy as a caregiver. "You're carrying so much," Natasha would say, her hand briefly touching his arm. "Who's taking care of you?" The affair began on a rainy Thursday evening in January. Marcus had called home to say he'd be working late again, hating the resignation, in Victoria's voice when she said she understood. Natasha had ordered Chinese takeout for the office, and somehow they'd found themselves alone, talking and laughing over lo mein and wine until the conversation turned serious. "I see how hard." "This is for you," Natasha had said, moving closer to him on the office couch. "You deserve happiness too." The kiss that followed felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously. Afterward, Marcus drove home in a fog of guilt and confusion, promising himself it would never happen again. But it did happen again, and again, until the stolen moments became a routine that both sustained and destroyed him. Natasha never pressured him about his marriage. She seemed to understand that he was struggling with an impossible situation, trapped between duty and desire. She made him feel young again, unburdened, like the man he'd been before wheelchairs and medical equipment became part of his daily vocabulary. "I don't want to complicate your life," she'd whisper during their clandestine meetings at a discreet hotel downtown. "I just want to give you some peace." For 3 months, Marcus lived a double life. He would spend his days at the office finding excuses to be near Natasha, then return home to Victoria's knowing eyes and Elena's quiet observations. He told himself he was protecting Victoria by maintaining the pretense that she didn't need the additional trauma of his betrayal on top of everything else she was enduring. But Victoria had always been too perceptive for her own good. The confrontation came on a Wednesday evening in March. Marcus walked into their living room to find Victoria sitting in her wheelchair, his phone in her lap, the screen displaying text messages he'd thought were private. "Her name is Natasha," Victoria said without preamble, her voice unnaturally calm. "Your assistant." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He'd forgotten his phone during his shower, something that had never happened before. "Victoria, I can explain." "Can you?" She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through his soul. "Can you explain how planning my replacement became part of your daily routine?" The conversation that followed was brutal in its honesty. Marcus found himself saying things he'd never meant to voice, how the accident had changed everything, how he felt trapped in a life he'd never chosen, how Natasha made him feel like himself again. With each word, he watched something die in Victoria's eyes. "I never wanted this either," Victoria said quietly when he'd finished. "But I thought we'd face it together. I thought our marriage meant something." "It does mean something," Marcus protested, but even as he said the words, they felt hollow. Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Not enough, apparently. The divorce proceedings began 2 weeks later. Marcus moved out of their shared home and into a downtown apartment, telling himself he felt relief rather than loss. Natasha was supportive through the entire process, never pushing for commitments, but making it clear she'd be there when he was ready for a new beginning. "You deserve to be happy," she'd remind him when guilt threatened to overwhelm him. "Victoria will be fine. She's stronger than you think." As the legal papers were signed and their 23-year marriage officially dissolved, Marcus tried to convince himself that he was making the right choice. He was 47 years old, too young to sacrifice the rest of his life to circumstances, beyond anyone's control. But late at night, when Natasha slept peacefully beside him, Marcus would stare at the ceiling and wonder if happiness built on someone else's devastation could ever truly be happiness at all. Part 3. The nurse's secret, Elena Vasquez, had spent 30 years caring for people at their most vulnerable moments, and she'd developed an instinct for recognizing predators. The skill had served her well during her years as a trauma nurse in Miami's emergency rooms, where she'd learned to spot the subtle signs of abuse, manipulation, and exploitation that others missed. When she first met Natasha Sterling at Victoria's home, something had prickled at the edges of Elena's memory. The young woman had accompanied Marcus during one of his brief visits, hovering near him with a solicitousness that seemed performative rather than genuine. Natasha's smile was perfect, her concern for Victoria's well-being articulated in exactly the right words, but Elena had noticed how her eyes remained calculating even as her voice dripped with sympathy. It took 3 weeks for the memory to crystallize. Elena was helping Victoria with her evening exercises when the realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd seen that face before, under different circumstances, wearing a different name. "Mrs. Blackwood," Elena said carefully, setting down the resistance bands they'd been using. "I need to tell you something about your husband's friend." Victoria paused in her stretching routine, immediately alert. Her writer's instinct for subtext had made her sensitive to the weight of unspoken words. "What about her?" Elena sat down across from Victoria, choosing her words carefully. "Before I came to work for your agency, I was employed at Sunset Gardens, a luxury assisted living facility in Miami. We catered to wealthy elderly residents who needed minimal care but maximum security." Victoria waited, sensing that Elena was building towards something significant. "There was a woman there, went by the name Catalina Reyes. She was about 25, beautiful, charming. She presented herself as a volunteer, someone who simply enjoyed spending time with older people. She focused particularly on our residents who were isolated, whose families lived far away or rarely visited." Elena's voice took on a harder edge as she continued. "Catalina became especially close to one of our residents, Mrs. Rosalind Hartwell. Rosalind was 83, sharp as a tack, but lonely. Her daughter lived in Europe and visited maybe twice a year. Catalina filled that void perfectly. She'd bring Rosalind her favorite pastries, listen to stories about her late husband, even learn to play bridge just to keep her company." Victoria felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. "What happened?" Over the course of 8 months, Catalina gradually inserted herself into every aspect of Rosalind's life. She helped manage her medications, accompanied her to doctor's appointments, even assisted with her financial paperwork. The staff all thought it was wonderful. Here was this young woman showing such devotion to an elderly resident who needed companionship. Elena stood and walked to the window, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. Then Rosalind changed her will. Instead of leaving her estate to various charities and distant relatives, she left everything to Catalina, nearly $3 million. 2 weeks later, Rosalind died in her sleep. And you think it wasn't natural causes? I think Rosalind's sleeping medication was being tampered with. I think her friend was slowly increasing the dosage until her heart couldn't handle it anymore. But by the time anyone had suspicions, Catalina Reyes had vanished. No forwarding address, no contact. Information like she'd never existed. Victoria absorbed this information, her mind already making connections. And you believe Natasha Sterling is the same person? Elena turned back to face her. Mrs. Blackwood, I may be 56 years old, but I have an excellent memory for faces. That's the same woman. The hair is different, she's lost some weight, but it's her. I'd stake my reputation on it. For several minutes, the room was silent except for the ticking of the antique clock Victoria's grandmother had left her. Finally, Victoria spoke. Have you told anyone else about this? Who would believe me? I have no proof beyond my own recognition, and the investigation into Rosalind's death never led to any charges. The police looked into Catalina's background but found nothing. No social security number, no previous addresses, no family. It was like she'd materialized out of thin air, just to target Rosalind. Detective James Morrison had been investigating financial crimes against the elderly for 8 years, long enough to recognize patterns that others might miss. When the phone call came from Victoria Blackwood, the mystery novelist whose work he'd admired for years, he initially assumed she wanted to consult on police procedures for her next book. Detective Morrison, Victoria said during their phone conversation, I believe I have information about a serial con artist who targets vulnerable elderly victims, someone who may be planning her next crime. That had gotten his attention immediately. 3. Days later, Morrison sat in Victoria's study, surrounded by the evidence she and Elena had compiled over the past month. Photographs, timelines, financial records that Elena had managed to obtain through her former colleagues at Sunset Gardens, and a comprehensive dossier that read like the plot of one of Victoria's novels, except this was terrifyingly real. Walk me through this again, Morrison said, studying the photograph of Catalina Reyes that Elena had provided. You believe this woman has been operating under different identities for how long? Victoria maneuvered her wheelchair closer to the evidence board they'd constructed. Based on what Elena and I have uncovered, at least 5 years, we've identified 3 confirmed cases: Catalina Reyes in Miami with Rosalind Hartwell, Carmen Delgado in Phoenix with businessman Harold Chen, and Celeste Moreau in New Orleans with widower Theodore Ashford. She pointed to the timeline they'd constructed. Each time, the pattern is identical. She appears in the victim's life during a period of vulnerability. Recent loss of a spouse, estrangement from family, serious health issues. She becomes indispensable, gains access to their finances, isolates them from other support systems, and then they die unexpectedly after changing their wills in her favor. Morrison examined the documents more closely. And you believe Natasha Sterling is the same person? Elena stepped forward. Detective, I worked with elderly patients for 3 decades. I've seen this face at its most unguarded when she thought no one was watching. It's her. The problem, Morrison said slowly, is that even if you're right, we have no concrete evidence linking these cases together. Different states, different identities, and in each case, the deaths were ruled natural causes. Victoria had anticipated this objection, which is why I've been working on something else. She gestured toward her laptop. I've written a detailed fictional account of these crimes, including specifics that only the perpetrator would know. It's called The Caretaker's Game, and I plan to publish it. Morrison looked puzzled. I don't understand how a novel helps us build a criminal case. Because, Victoria explained, if Natasha Sterling reads a book that describes her methods in perfect detail, she'll know that someone has connected the dots. She'll either make a mistake trying to cover her tracks, or she'll panic and run, and either reaction will give us the evidence we need. Over the following weeks, Morrison worked within official channels while Victoria pursued her literary strategy. He contacted law enforcement in Miami, Phoenix, and New Orleans, requesting that they reopen their investigations with fresh eyes. Meanwhile, Victoria finished her manuscript and arranged for expedited publication through her existing publisher. "This is your most chilling work yet," her editor told her during their final review. "The psychological detail is extraordinary. It's like you've been inside the mind of a real sociopath." "Sometimes," Victoria replied, "truth is stranger than fiction." The book launched quietly, without the usual publicity campaign. Victoria wanted it to find its way to Natasha through natural channels: bookstore displays, online recommendations, the kind of organic discovery that wouldn't seem like a targeted accusation. Meanwhile, Morrison's investigation began yielding results. The Phoenix police had located Harold Chen's former housekeeper, who remembered being dismissed shortly before Carmen Delgado moved in full-time. The New Orleans detectives found irregularities in Theodore Ashford's medication records that hadn't been noticed during the original investigation. "We're building a case," Morrison told Victoria during one of their weekly meetings. "But it's going to take time to gather enough evidence for an arrest warrant." Victoria nodded, but her attention was focused on a different timeline. Through Elena's careful observation, they knew that Natasha had already begun laying groundwork, with Marcus encouraging him to update his will, suggesting they purchase life insurance policies together, gradually taking control of small financial decisions. "She's accelerating her timeline," Victoria observed. "Usually she spends at least a year building trust before making major moves, but she's been with Marcus for less than 6 months, and she's already pushing for deeper financial entanglement." Morrison frowned. "What do you think that means?" Victoria's expression was grim. "I think it means she knows she's running out of time. Maybe she's seen the book, maybe she's sensed that someone is asking questions. Either way, she's going to make her move soon." Elena, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Mrs. Blackwood, if you're right, then Marcus is in immediate danger. We can't wait for the legal system to catch up." Victoria turned to Morrison. "Detective, how would you feel about setting a trap?" Part 5. Justice served. Detective Morrison had orchestrated undercover operations before, but never one that felt quite so personal. As he watched from an unmarked van across the street from Marcus Thornfield's apartment building, he reflected on how the past 3 months had transformed a routine financial crimes investigation into something that felt like a thriller novel, which, he supposed, was fitting given the circumstances. The trap they'd designed was elegant in its simplicity. Victoria had arranged for Marcus to receive an advance copy of The Caretaker's Game through a mutual friend in the publishing industry, along with a note suggesting he might find it interesting given his recent experiences with predatory people who take advantage of others' vulnerabilities. The timing was perfect. Natasha had been staying at Marcus's apartment more frequently, giving her easy access to his mail and personal belongings. Elena, meanwhile, had cultivated a friendship with the building's concierge, allowing her to monitor Natasha's comings and goings. For 2 weeks, they'd watched and waited, looking for signs that Natasha had discovered the book and recognized herself in its pages. The break came on a Tuesday morning. Elena called Morrison from her position in the coffee shop across from Marcus's building. "She's leaving with 2 suitcases," Elena reported. "Moving fast, looking over her shoulder. I think she's spooked." Morrison immediately activated the surveillance team he'd positioned around the building. They followed Natasha as she took a circuitous route through the city, clearly checking for tails, before arriving at a storage facility on the outskirts of town. "She's accessing Unit 247, Officer Rodriguez reported through the radio. "Looks like she's retrieving additional luggage and what appears to be documentation." This was the moment Morrison had been waiting for. The storage unit would contain evidence of Natasha's previous identities, the paper trail that had allowed her to disappear and reinvent herself multiple times. As she loaded everything into a rental car, Morrison gave the signal for his team to move. The arrest was anticlimactic. Natasha, whose real name they would later discover was Nicole Stratton, didn't resist or attempt to run. She simply stood beside her car, hands raised, wearing an expression of resignation that suggested she'd always known this day would come. The evidence found in her storage unit was overwhelming. False identification documents for Catalina Reyes, Carmen Delgado, and Celeste Moreau. Detailed notes about her previous victims' routines, medical conditions, and financial situations. Most damning of all, vials of various medications and a journal documenting dosages and timing, a methodical record of how she'd gradually poisoned her victims while maintaining the appearance of natural death. Marcus arrived at the police station 3 hours later, summoned by a phone call from Morrison. The man who walked into the interview room looked like he'd aged a decade in a single day. When Morrison explained what Natasha had been planning, how the life insurance policies she'd encouraged him to purchase would have made her a very wealthy widow, Marcus collapsed into a chair. "She was going to kill me," he said, the words coming out in a whisper. "She was actually going to kill me." "Most likely within the next few months," Morrison confirmed. "We found detailed notes about your routine, your health, your finances. You fit her victim profile perfectly. Recently divorced, emotionally vulnerable, financially comfortable, and isolated from your previous support network." Marcus looked up with haunted eyes. "How did you know? How did you figure it out?" Morrison glanced toward the door where Victoria sat in her wheelchair, having insisted on being present for this moment. "Your ex-wife is a very observant woman, and she has excellent instincts for recognizing when someone is lying." The reunion between Marcus and Victoria was awkward, fraught with months of pain and betrayal that couldn't be erased by the revelation of Natasha's true nature. But there was also relief. Relief that he was alive, that the truth had emerged, that they both understood now what they'd been dealing with. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, the words inadequate but sincere. "I'm so sorry for everything."